Thanks so much, and thanks so much for inviting me. And it's quite late, so we want to keep it simple, I think. Okay, so my goal is here to make it as simple as possible. That also has to do that I can't think only simple, unfortunately. Okay, first, what is autism for many of you probably who don't know? Autism is basically a kind of a disorder which comes in a large spectrum, if you want. So there are many, many different forms of autism. That's why we speak usually from autisms rather than from autism nowadays. And there are three basically major areas which are impacted. The one is social communication. The second one are language deficits, so the development of language is impaired in the children. And the third one is that these children show a whole range of restrictive and repetitive behaviors. Unfortunately, because of time, I can't go into the individual symptoms. But these three areas are basically what's called the core symptoms of autism. Associated with autism are a whole range of other comorbidities, disorders, other abnormalities where the field is fighting about since 40 years now. One of them is that they have usually measured lower own IQ. Somewhere between 30 and 70% of the children with autism, depending which study you believe and also which time you live in, okay? Now it's less than before, but somewhere in this range, basically, children with autism score on an IQ test in the range of less than 70. About somewhere between 10 and 30% of children with autism develop epilepsy. There is a whole discussion why they would develop epilepsy, but it's important to note that they basically develop epilepsy at usually in the adolescence, some of them, however, very early on. And then there are a whole range of psychiatric disorders like anxiety and other some type of depressive symptoms associated with the disorder. Let me see what I can forward, yes. So again, these are basically the autism spectrum disorders. And until recently, basically, we had autistic disorder, or classic autism, we want, Asperger's disorder, PDD, NOS, and childhood disintegrated disorder. This will all change now with the new DSM. Whether this will be better and move us forwards, or whether we go backwards, we can probably, again, discuss for quite some time. I'm not sure yet. Let's see where this leads us, but this will change. But be this as it is, there is a whole range, basically, of autisms. Now, what do we know about the etiology? The one thing we know that it's in one form or the other moderate to strongly genetic. However, despite having done tons of GWAS studies and similar things, no common allele has been shown to be associated with autism consistently. However, what has been shown is that there is a whole range of rare genetic variations that account for about 10 to 20% of the cases. And that's probably a very optimistic estimate. There also has been shown that there is a higher rate of de novo events in these children. There are about more than 100 genes basically have been implicated. So these rare alleles are not in one gene. They are in many, many, many different genes, and everybody of you can pick his favorite genes, and then they will find probably some case which has autistic and has some form of the mutations there. Now, what about environmental factors? Few environmental factors have been implicated. The ones are basically, the most common ones are pregnancy complications. There's also increased parental age. Both increased age of the mother as well as increased age of the father has been associated with a higher rate of autism in children. The age of the mother is usually associated with pregnancy complications. The age of the father, people assume, has to do with a higher rate of de novo events. So, where does this leave us? This leaves us that since we started, basically, since it was defined in 1942 by Leo Kanner, the strongest known risk factor has always been male. Okay? The rate of autism is 4 to 1. So there are 4 times more children diagnosed with autism who are male than who are female. That's one of the few things which are really consistent. I say a lot of things which are wrong, but that's the one which is consistent. It could be now 2.5 or it could be 6 or something. Certainly there's a range here. But overall, there is no study which would doubt that we have a higher rate of autism, or of diagnosis, I must admit, in children who are male and are diagnosed with autism than female. Okay, now I'm studying twins amongst other things, and now let's look briefly at twins, and let's then come back to this question about the risk factors, okay? Now, to make it very simple is that in twins, basically, there are 2 types. The ones are monozygotic, they share all their genes. The ones are dizygotic, share 50% of the genes. And then there are 2 types of environments, okay? The one is a shared environment, and the other one is a unique environment. And for this talk, all you got to know is that the unique environment draws the kids apart, and the shared environment pushes them together. So if they share the environment, basically they are more closer to each other. If the unique environment makes them basically dissimilar. And the genes basically makes them more similar if they are monozygotic, and also more similar, but to a much less degree, if they are dizygotic. Again, they share 50% of the genes. Okay? Though, let us assume the risk factor being male. What would this, on a genetic basis, on a modeling basis, what would we basically predict? If the one thing would be that different, let's think about the first model. The one idea would be basically that there are different types of genes and environments that affect male and females. So meaning basically that gene A reacts in males and gene B basically acts in females. And similar with the environments. If this would be the case, then what we predict basically would be that male siblings of a female-affected siblings are less likely to be affected than the male siblings of a male-affected child. Okay? However, what we find is that's not the case. As you can see, these are basically the concordance rates, meaning how concordance means if one has autism, that the other one has autism, then they are concordant for autism. Okay? If one has autism and one is not autism, then he's discordant. So basically what we find that this is exactly to the opposite from our predictions. Okay? Now let's go one step further then. So what's the other possibility? The other possibility is the strongest known protective factor is being female, meaning that the female sex protects you basically to develop autism. And if you look there at the data, then what you would predict, again, from a genetic model, what you would expect is that the female sibling of a male-affected child is less likely to be affected than the female sibling of a female-affected child. And if you look at our data, that's exactly what you would find. Now, there was just, actually, a couple of weeks, I'm lucky, you know, I agreed this talk, and then there's a paper coming out which could not fit better, actually, where they did a little bit of a different tag than we did. But they basically modeled here autism as a quantitative trait. And if you model it basically as a quantitative trait and you assume that there's a protective factor, what you then would predict is that with the same degree of impairment, siblings of a female-affected child are more affected than siblings of a male-affected child. And that's exactly what this study showed. So you can see here basically the siblings of all non-probants, these are the gray ones, the siblings of the male probants, and then you can see the siblings of the female probants. These are two different population-based studies, okay? These are basically two studies, independent studies, which show both, which they analyzed in the same paper, and they both showed the same research by Robinson, was just published a couple of weeks ago. So basically, what this means is that the central question is not so much what's the risk factor, but probably the central question is why are females protected? Now, like every study or like every model, we have to be very careful. I mean, twin modeling is only a glimpse, so to speak, what could be, never what is. So there are definitely alternative models. One is, for example, that there's a greater influence of unique environment factors which is specifically acting in boys, okay? Another one would be, and that's a very long-standing discussion in the autism world, is whether our definition of autism is not gender biased to start with. And on this one, I think I'll bring up my friend Antonio, who will tell us everything about gender biases and what we find on a clinical level different between males and females.
Very good. I'm a child psychiatrist, so I'm a clinician, and I do research in autism. And I will tell you a little bit about the differences in clinical features that we see in kids, adolescents, and adults with autism, comparing males to females. So what we've been shown, and this is a little bit something we've seen clinically, is that female in general, they have more severe symptoms when you compare them to males with autism. And in one domain that's clearly been documented is in the social domain. Joachim mentioned there are three main domains in autism. One is the social, the other one is the communication, and the third one is the restricted repetitive patterns of behaviors. The second area that people have looked at is cognitive abilities and abilities to process different information with regard to receptive language and perceptual abilities and motor skills. And again, here we're seeing that females are more affected than males. In another study that looked at specifically communication and expressive language, that's the second domain that Joachim mentioned. and we see again the same pattern, which is females with autism are a little bit more affected than males. So the story is not all bad. When people looked at the third domain, which is the restricted repetitive patterns of behavior, that's people who are, that's the symptom domain that describes people who are interested in one specific thing, or individuals who have stereotypic behaviors. And there have been several studies that looked at that, and they've showed that females are, in general, less affected compared to males. And here, we show a little bit of study that we've done here. We have a research registry, and we looked at the male and females who are in the research registry. And we looked at kids between the age of 2 and 18s. And on average, males had higher level of restricted repetitive pattern of behaviors, restricted and repetitive pattern or stereotypic behaviors. And it's interesting, this, if you look at the figure, it starts a little bit high and decreases over time. And that's what actually we see in clinics, is that patients, they will have more restricted repetitive patterns early on, and they decrease as they're getting older. When we dug a little bit more into this restricted repetitive patterns of behavior, we saw two domains where females were more affected than males. One of them is the stereotyped motor behaviors. That's the flapping or the jumping. And the second one is the restricted interest. As you all know, the individuals with autism, they have specific interests that are very much interested in, such as knowing too much about video games, or knowing too much about dinosaurs, or knowing too much about, for example, telephone poles. So we've noticed, based on our studies, that individuals with autism, male individuals with autism, are a little bit more affected than females. Now, other areas that people have looked at is looking at the cognitive domains or executive function domain. And unfortunately, females are, in general, more affected than males. And here in this study by Lemon and all, they've looked at response inhibition, attention to details, visual receptive scores, processing speed, coding, and symbol search. In different cognitive domains, females were a little bit more affected than males. Now, how does that translate to functioning and long-term outcome? Unfortunately, if you have several strikes against you, it's going to affect a little bit your long-term outcome. And studies have looked at that, even though these studies are very small, and I will discuss that a little bit in the next slide. Interestingly, when you look at associated symptoms that are not related to the core features, not related to social or restricted repetitive patterns of language, look at anxiety, depression. Unfortunately, you see more psychopathology in females with autism compared to males with autism. Interestingly, there is one study by Simons and all that looked at the response rate in a study that looked at naltrexone in individuals with self-injurious behaviors, and they found that females responded less well or much less compared to males. So what are the limitations of these clinical studies? Is that there are a handful of studies. The largest one was conducted in 1982, which include like about 50 to 60 individuals. And probably the studies that will, once we published our study, probably it will be the largest studies. Most of them are small sample sizes. And when you look at small sample sizes, as expected, the findings are not very consistent. So that's when we look at the clinical phenotype. I want to move a little bit and talk a little bit about imaging studies. There have been quite a handful of studies that looked at structural brain abnormalities in male with autism compared to female with autism. And the first study is by Bloss and Kurshane, and they looked at 9 girls with autism, compared them to 27 boys with autism, but also they had typically developing children, male and female children, who they've used as controls. And what they found is that, in general, girls exhibited the same volumetric brain differences from control as boys with autism. So we know that individuals with autism or boys with autism, they have increased brain size. They have decreased size of the corpus callosum. They have increased amygdalar volume. And what they've noticed that in their sample, even though it's very small, 9 girls, they've seen the same patterns. Interestingly, they also were able to find abnormalities that were not reported before, such as the increase in intracranial and temporal gray matter, and a significant reduction in the cerebellar gray matter, which from a neurobiologic point of view will be very interesting if these will be replicated. So it could be more specific, more gender specific. Also, when they compared female with autism to typical developing females, and girls and boys with autism compared to typically developing boys, they've noticed there's a greater disparity in the female comparisons compared to the male and male ASD and typically developing males. More studies looking at the development. In the previous study, the Kursian group looked at cross-sectional studies. Here, this is from the same lab. They've looked at longitudinal studies. So it's not cross-sectional, but these individuals had more than one scan. And these were toddlers who they were scanned before the diagnosis was confirmed. But later on, when the diagnosis was confirmed, they've included them. Because at age 18 months or 24 months, you don't have a high level of confidence with regard to the diagnosis that you've made. That's why in some of the approaches that people will follow these kids, and once they are confirmed, they will include them in, when the diagnosis is confirmed, they will include them in the study. They have looked at 32 males and 9 females. These are essentially with autism. And they've noted there is increased amygdalar volumes in toddlers with autism, and that's something that we saw from cross-sectional studies. However, interestingly, that the differences were more pronounced in females. So this replicates a little bit the previous study, not only from a cross-sectional point of view, but from a longitudinal point of view. And when they looked at the developmental trajectory of the brain, females had more brains involved, but also they had more abnormalities overall. Last set of studies that looked at brain imaging in autism, a study by Craig and al. And when they looked at female with autism compared to typically developing females, so there's no males involved here. And they've used an efficient way to look at different brain regions. It's called voxel-based morphometry, and they compared gray and white matter density between the two groups. What they found is that female with autism exhibited the same pattern that you see with male with autism, but unfortunately, the area that had been involved were a little bit more extensive. Another study by Calderoni and al., it's an Italian group, that looked at actually a large number of females with autism, and I think the number around 38, so that's quite significant. And they compared females with autism compared to typically developing females. And they used an approach to identify patterns to be able to see if they can classify the individuals based on abnormalities in their gray or white matter. And what they found, they used the support vector machine approach, and they found that excess gray matter in the superior frontal gyrus and in the temporal parietal junction was able to predict the group, which means they were able to discriminate between the two groups, between individual with autism, female with autism, and typically developing females. So that's a little bit a bird's eye view of all these studies from a clinical phenotype to neuroimaging phenotype. And to conclude a little bit the state of boys, girls in autism, this is definitely an understudied area. And there have been a lot of application examining the clinical phenotype in autism, comparing male to females. And there is a large study that was funded last year looking at, it's a multi-center studies that looked at girls with autism and trying to compare them with boys with autism. So in general, there is a more severe symptomatology in females with autism. Maybe there are some areas that are spared, such as the repetitive behavior domain. Most of the studies so far have been very small. And there are a lot of challenges to investigate boys and girls in autism. One of them is recruitment. So as Joachim mentioned, the prevalence rates are a little bit less when you compare male to females. So it's very hard to recruit females. And in a study that we submitted last year, we actually wanted to recruit from all over the country. The other challenge is looking at matching in terms of how you're going to match the two different groups. And the other issue that is a little bit, we're becoming a little bit more aware of it, is the ability to diagnose high-functioning girls with autism. As we've mentioned, Most girls, when they are affected, they have a little bit more severe phenotype, clinical phenotype. And it's much easier for us to diagnose individuals with severe symptoms. But how about the individuals who are a little bit more on the, who have mild symptoms? But despite all these challenges, this is a great opportunities for us, great opportunity for us to be able to understand the disorder or disorders of autism, because we've been studying males and we've made some progress, but not as much as we would like to. So maybe if we tackle the boy-girl challenge, maybe we'll be able to learn more about autism. Thank you.